Supporting our event today. It is my very great pleasure and privilege to welcome our speaker, Marie Myung-Ok Lee, who is a writer in residence at the Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Race here at Columbia. Let me just say a couple of words about Marie before I hand things over to her. She received her BA from Brown University and was writer in residence there before she began teaching fiction here at Columbia. She has published quite a large number of books. I was pretty amazed looking them up, including the groundbreaking novel, some of you may know, titled Finding My Voice, which is considered to be the first contemporary set young adult novel with an Asian protagonist. Her many stories and essays have appeared in such periodicals as The Atlantic, the New York Times, Slate, Guernica, The Emancipator, and The Guardian, among others. So we are very lucky to have her here today to speak about her most recent work, the fabulous novel, The Evening Hero, which came out last year, 2022, from Simon & Schuster, and was, among many other things, a Good Morning America Book Club Buzz pick, and chosen as Best of 2022 by both Oprah and Real Simple magazines, among others. She has received many awards and recognition for her work in general. I am so excited to hear her talk about this book in particular and about her work process and thinking more generally. I just want to add one thing that really struck me in particular, and that is that she is one of the very few journalists who has been admitted into North Korea since the Korean War. And what particularly amazed me about this is something I actually learned from this novel, The Evening Hero, which is that there is a particular animus and bias in North Korea against Korean Americans, members of the Korean diaspora in the United States. So I am dying to know how you wangled that. But in the meantime, please, Marie.
Great, thank you so much. For this great welcome. I'm going to keep my mask on, but I'll try to project. And if you're having trouble, just like raise your hand and I'll try to project more. And thanks for that great introduction, Kim. Actually, I have written a bunch of books, but this book has taken me 18 years to write and get published. So I'm super grateful that you're here today to hear me talk about it. And first, I'd also like to thank the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, especially its director, Professor Hang Nguyen, for inviting me. This Center for Korean Research for sponsoring, and Julie Kwan for organizing, and to Kim Brandt for being my conversational partner. So The Evening Hero is a novel that follows the fractured trajectory of Dr. Young-man Kwak. He's a 70-year-old OBGYN in a rural Minnesota town who at the opening of the book learns that his hospital has been closed because of a private equity takeover. He doesn't know what he wants to do the rest of his life, but he knows he still wants to help people. So he temporarily ends up working at his son Einstein for-profit medical startup at the Mall of America. So this novel cuts back and forth between the contemporary time and Young-man's childhood in North Korea before it became North Korea. And basically how the war's upheaval split his family apart, but also how it ended up spitting him out into sort of South Korea, and how the war eventually acted as a catalyzing factor that allowed him to immigrate to the US with his fiance, who was also born in his small village in North Korea. So the novel spends a lot of time watching Young-man as a child and young adult as he gets buffeted around by geopolitics, not unlike my parents, who were both also born in North Korea and ended up as American citizens in the rural Midwest. So the text is not as important. So this is my father, Dr. William Chishik Lee, and he is with his friend from the war, Lieutenant Colonel Ridgely Ryan. And I will explain a little more about how these things have seeped into the novel. But I'm going to back up a little bit to talk a little bit about how the novelist process is extremely messy, and getting to these fixed number of words is actually almost a miracle. So the novel actually started out as a completely different novel. It was a contemporary novel that was not about our evening hero, Jungmann, but it was about Einstein, Jungmann's son. And in the novel now, Einstein is faded a little bit more into the background. He's just kind of off there struggling with his sort of medical growth startup in the Mall of America. Einstein's also an OBGYN. But in the earlier draft, the draft, in fact, that was sold to Simon & Schuster, the title was the Einstein Code.
Huh.
And it was later called First Son of a First Son. And it was much more of a novel about late stage capitalism in medicine, as well as the ambition and folly of the young doctor. And it was inspired by, are there any Middlemarch fans? It was inspired by the doctor character in Middlemarch. But actually, while the book was under contract, since it has been since 2012, in 2016, the election changed so much of American culture that I felt like I wanted to more directly face some of the underpinnings of what we see today in anti-immigrant rhetoric and anti-Asian hate. And also with the election, a lot of the satire just kind of went out the window because satire depends on excess. And now we have excess every single freaking day, where we've had 2 anti-Asian shootings within 3 days of each other. Like, how do you do satire now in a world like this? So I ended up pulling back and then deciding that I'm going to focus on Jungmann. I'm going to focus on his story and the kind of person that other people see as an undocumented immigrant, this little Asian person, this elderly person. What kind of epic story does he have, and how did he end up here? So I'm going to start by reading a small section here about this guy named Lieutenant Jarvis and Jungmann. And right here, the hospital has just closed, but Jungmann is trying to get a university hospital in a larger city to take his patient. And so Jarvis is kind of this guy, and I'll explain more. But Jungmann has a surprising card up his sleeve. I'm sorry about your patient, the secretary said, but it sounds like we really can't help you. I need to talk to Dr. Rock Nelson, he said. This was the equivalent of asking her to call her manager. Jungmann wasn't normally the type to be pushy. But what was the downside of cashing in on this chip he'd been carrying for decades? Use it or lose it, his friend Ken would have said. The secretary passed him on to another secretary. You can't just talk to President Nelson, the secretary audibly sniffed. Does he know you? Actually, he doesn't, Jungmann said. I knew his colleague, the late Dr. Jarvis, whom I met during the Korean War. So are you saying you want to make an appointment to speak to him? Are you pressed? He's booked until Thanksgiving. I need to talk to him about Professor Jarvis. The Dr. Jarvis of the Jarvis Medal for Research Excellence. Immediately. Mention of the Jarvis Medal got her attention. He was put on hold. He counted to 3. 1, 2, 3. He was patched through. This is Rock. How can I help you? The man was very self-assured, so humbly using his first name with a stranger. Hello, my name is Dr. William Kwok from Horse's Breath General Hospital. I knew Dr. Jarvis from the Korean War. In fact, he was the one who helped me get my student visa to come to the US. Very nice. I would appreciate you getting to the point. I'm a busy man. Jarvis may have wanted to wash his hands of Jungmann, but the blood of history is not washable. Jungmann's eyes had popped at the notice in the Journal of American Medical Association that a memorial research award had been established in Jarvis's name. Even more so that the honor was being bestowed for his quote-unquote groundbreaking researching into the effects of frostbite on mobilized troops during the Korean War. Jungmann had laughed through his nose. Then he cried. When Jungmann had first met Jarvis, Lieutenant Jarvis, he was 12 and working as a houseboy on the American Air Force Base Chilpal, which was near his village. Jarvis appeared at the base one day. His Scandinavian eyebrows were so pale, they made his face look science fictional. The houseboys had been told he was a very important doctor in Mibuk and do whatever he asked them to do. Oddly, he gave them packets of balloons and told them to befriend the harlots who lived in the ramshackle shacks a few yards from the rear gate of the base. Youngman had been trying to soak up any English at the time and noticed that these balloons were called lovers. The harlots laughed later when they saw the boys kept a few of these balloons for themselves and blew them up into fancy cucumber shapes. Then Jarvis wanted them to spy on the women to see if any of them were itching in the pojee and make note of their name, their Hubble number, and even get the number of their ID card. Subsequently, American police would visit these hovels, sometimes Jarvis himself. The women never looked happy being led away to that dark concrete structure that everyone in the base called the monkey house. Decades later, now a doctor himself, Youngman came across the study. Prophylactic distribution and the mitigation of FTD spread among wartime troops. His mentor's name hidden by the initials in a thicket of co-authors, as Jarvis was then well known and lauded as a frostbite researcher. However, Jarvis's methods of getting the data for his STD study had been flagged for being problematic in terms of consent and transparency. But after all those years, there was no one but Youngman to put these two facts about that one man together. Youngman explained his patient's situation. Dr. Kwok, I don't know why you're taking up my time here, but I don't exactly do the admittance for the hospital. I'm the CEO. Yes, Youngman said. You see, Horace's Breath is going out of business on Friday. I'm truly sorry to hear that, but the mother is your patient. I hope another hospital will take her. Good day. Wait, you don't want to have sexually transmitted diseases attached to the Jarvis award, do you? Excuse me? Youngman pressed on. He quickly summarized Jarvis's harlot project. Youngman had learned later that the harlots with the itching pojees were taken to the monkey house, and at the behest of the US military, who wanted to make sure the soldiers had only clean women, were pumped so full of powerful antibiotics and other drugs that the side effects made their shoulders sag, their arms and wrists dangle near their knees like monkeys, and they walked that way even after they got better. Some of the harlots, Youngman knew them all by sight, never came back. Youngman had overheard the GIs talking about how a nearby squash patch had to be repurposed as an unmarked graveyard for the dead harlots, some of whom had originally been kidnapped as sex slaves for the Japanese. Some were not much older than Youngman. Youngman's benefactor, Jarvis, really should have been punished for this somehow, but so many terrible things done to the Koreans by their allies seemed to just be chalked up to the cost of war. So as I mentioned, Colonel Richard Lee Ryan was the person, one of the people who helped my father immigrate to the US. He immigrated in 1953, right after the war ended. And there was actually another person who was a doctor from the World Health Organization. His name was Dr. Schumann. And yes, he was actually doing research on frostbite. Mm-hmm. But while I was doing research for the novel, I also came across a cache of really disturbing research that American doctors were doing on live Koreans, including things like testing these antibiotics. But this stuff was really just so gruesome to the point that it would be distracting. And also a lot of it actually came from some of the Japanese experiments that had been done on live people. So what I wanted to do, Jarvis is his own character, but he's a conflation of these two people who helped my father. Lieutenant Jarvis is partly Colonel Ridgely Ryan, and he's partly the WHO doctor, Dr. Schumann, except Jarvis is his own character, and in a weird, fun is not the kind of word, but in a kind of interesting play, is Dr. Schumann, who is, he's not Jarvis. Dr. Schumann, in fact, was one of the first doctors who was brave enough to testify in court, I think in the 50s, that cigarettes are bad for you. Mm-hmm. At the time, the whole thing was cigarettes are great for you. And Philip Morris was like this huge corporation that had so much power. So it was basically like taking these two people and using their background to help me figure out kind of like the structure of what Jarvis would be like, but letting him be his he's actually at night, and he looked a lot like this, very clean cut. And so in a way, as a full human being, he did, like, this guy helped my father help Youngman immigrate, but at the same time, he was a monster. So the next part too is that, so the other reason this piece that I read it's not my father, is because Youngman is my father's like a different generation, but I needed Youngman for sort of like authorial purposes to be a houseboy, because I figured if he was young but sort of infiltrated into the military, he would not only see everything, because people wouldn't think he would understand, but then he would see everything and he wouldn't kind of always understand until he was older. So this is something that could be done over the scope of the book. So where this goes next, let's see. Sorry, I have to do this. I've heard before. Can you tell me where the PowerPoint is of all these icons? Or is it just this one?
I think it's,
Wait, where did it go? Sorry. Okay, yeah. Thank you. Okay, yeah, perfect. Thank you. I hope I don't have to do this for these slides. So this person is my uncle. And my uncle escaped from North Korea and it ended up in Seoul, but without any money or any family. He basically escaped with just the clothes on his back. And he also didn't know my father was also in South Korea. So he, in order to survive, became an army houseboy and he worked in the motor pool. In this particular picture, he's pretending this car is his. He thought he could try to impress girls with his picture. So a lot of what I learned from being a houseboy was asking my cousin and interviewing my uncle. And he just had so many interesting, wonderful, like funny stories, including about how he got promoted to being a bartender from being a houseboy. And then he had to make all these drinks. So, in his old age, he still remembers how to make like Tom Collins and like all these very weird like American drinks. But that still, like, they didn't get very much food. Like, he'd come as a refugee, so he was always starving to death. But he was super honest. So when he was selling the donuts along with the booze, he would never ever steal, because the Americans always felt like, oh, the Koreans just steal. And he didn't think that was the right stereotype. So he wanted to make sure he never even looked like he was stealing. So what he would do is he would painstakingly pick up each grain of sugar that fell off the donuts, and then he would eat them, because he was so hungry. So, okay, I'm scared to do this. Oh, yay. Okay, so so that's my father and my uncle once they were reunited. They're in front of Seoul National University. And I am going to explain now, that's actually not my uncle. They are actually fairly distant cousins, but because both of them had no family, they just started calling each other brother, and they've always considered themselves family. And we have, as a family, we've always considered them to be family. I call him uncle, and my uncle too, from going from a penniless refugee, knowing no one in Seoul, he ended up following my father into Seoul National University. He got a law degree, and he became extremely wealthy. So we used to call Uneng Samchun, he's banker uncle, because he was the president of a bank. So my uncle's trajectory to some degree was more, because he was younger, he's a lot younger than my father, was more sort of like the inspiration for Youngman, because my father came to the US, like many immigrants, Korean immigrants, he was already a doctor, so he became a doctor. He didn't kind of follow that same trajectory that Youngman did. So among fiction writers, there are certain people, there's a certain segment where people kind of prize imagination over everything else. So there are certain authors, Mona Simpson's one of them, and I'm not making any kind of judgment, but she'd written this whole novel about Egypt and then talked about how she'd never been to Egypt. She personally did not go there until after she'd written the novel. And she had these whole reasons where she just wanted to have this Egypt of her imagination. So I don't have any particular way that I feel about it, but for this particular novel, because it's a historical novel, it involves real people and real battles and real history. I felt like I needed to make everything as confirmable as possible so that readers could get a kind of you are there feeling. The Italian writer Umberto Eco, for instance, in one of his novels, I think it's The Name of the Rose, he has a scene where a character gets off a train and he gets onto another train. He actually took the whole train journey just to make sure he'd have enough time, the character would have enough time to transfer. And I actually adopted that extremity for this book as well, because one of the things that I felt like I needed to do purposely is to move the narrative away from sort of the tropes, the narrative that we already know and in the history books, and back into the survivors' views, not from historians, not political scientists, but the survivors, including American veterans. There were more American veterans than we think were over there. For instance, in Vietnam, I think about like 54,000 American service people died, but in Korea, I think 56,000 American service people died. So we always feel like, oh, it's a forgotten war. There must not have been anything to remember it for, but no, it's just more within like our American empire, I think, because that was sort of a failed war. We're just going to forget about it, but we can't forget about it because it affects everybody. So back to like how I was trying to make this sort of confirmable. Basically, every single detail in the book is something I have gleaned from oral histories of Korean survivors and or veterans. With veterans, it's a little easier because there's many caches of letters. This is before the internet, so they actually have a lot of letters. The military, there are actually a lot of veterans groups who are very helpful to me getting just all this memorabilia. So that part was easy. It was a little more difficult getting things out of other Koreans. But in my particular case, because like the subtitle of this talk is, how do you write back into things that you don't know, but you wish you knew? And a lot of times with ethnic writers, people often give this idea like, oh, well, you just write down what your grandma told you, and that's your whole novel. And, I'm always kind of trying to push back on that too, because that's just not kind of accurate about how the creative process works. And it's so similarly, I'm going to talk a little bit about how Myung-Man has to become a refugee. Basically, in Korea, it's kind of like the North invaded, and then the US would try to push it back, and the North invaded again, and things just kind of went back and forth all the time. And that's why if you see pictures of it, you just see like long lines of refugees. People are always constantly being evacuated and having to just run away basically from all the bombing, including Allied bombing. Allied bombing actually caused the majority of the murders and death and property destruction during the war. So Myung-Man, like many Koreans, he's living in a small village kind of by what would become the military demarcation line, but it's within like shooting distance of Seoul. So he ends up having to evacuate to Busan. And during what's called the January 4th evacuation, and I'll speak about that a little bit more. But this particular detail, I just want to kind of like unpack. When he's in Busan, he keeps smelling this very weird smell. Because he's living in a shanty town. Basically, Busan was already like overloaded and had bad infrastructure. And that's when more and more refugees came in. This was the second evacuation. Everyone just lived in these shanty towns that were constantly like catching on fire. They were just like cardboard. People made them out of C ration cans. Myung-Man keeps smelling this weird smell, and it turns out it's burning bodies from a crematorium. And then I thought, this seems so important to me for many reasons. So the whole thing about the crematorium. But as I was studying more about like Korean religious and like body rights, I learned that in Korean Buddhism and a lot of traditional and a lot of other traditions, Koreans forbid burning or often mutilating, like, mutilating is not the right word, but just like moving somehow of a body, of the injuring of the body. It's a lot about like when we disinterred my grandfather, we actually had to spend hours making sure like not a teeny tiny fragment was left behind. there's a lot about the body being kept whole. So then I thought, well, this is not going to work because, you know, Koreans don't burn their bodies, and but I really like this crematorium scene, and for some reason I really need it. So, but then when I interviewed a survivor, she said that her grandparents mentioned a crematorium in Busan. And I was able to find it when they gave me some, not coordinates, but where. And so what was interesting about this was that this particular crematorium was a holdover from the Japanese colonization. Cremation is a part of Japanese Shinto. So during the colonization, in order to try to kill Korean culture, the Japanese did put all these crematoriums all over Korea and made them burn bodies to deliberately insult Koreans. But after the liberation, most of these crematoriums, of course, were immediately destroyed by the Koreans, but this one in Busan remained. And one of the reasons it remained was because Allied soldiers, we think, oh, the US saved Korea, yay, but we kind of forget there were a lot of different countries that sent soldiers to Korea for the Korean War. So what would happen is the soldiers from the poorer nations, like Ethiopia or Colombia, they didn't have the money to have the bodies preserved and sent back. So they kept this crematorium open so they could burn the bodies. And that is what Yongman was smelling during the war. So it's eventually, after being able to do enough research, the details fell in. So I felt like I could much more confidently write into this because I knew finally that it was accurate. So just to let you know, let's see, the other countries include United Kingdom. This is in descending order of how many soldiers. United Kingdom, Philippines, Thailand, Canada, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, Ethiopia, Greece, France, Colombia, Belgium, South Africa, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So this is also this history has been completely lost of all these other countries wanting to join this sort of UN force. Like we don't even remember. And a lot of the people that I interviewed would talk about, oh, like the Turks were like really good fighters and so forth. And so, and then one of the points that I was talking about writing your way into what you don't know, again, is, you know, I thought, oh, I'll ask my parents, like, what was the war like? But my parents did not want to talk about the war. They're going to be split families. It was so traumatic. And then anything that they did tell me, half of it did not make sense. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't know if it was their memory or whatever. So this whole thing, like, you just ask your grandma what the story is such a facile understanding of how you write a novel. And that still just bugs me so much. So I'm going to read a quick little piece about this January 4th evacuation.
January 4th of what year?
1951. It's the second one.
Okay.
Yes. Youngman and his family made the entire 50-kilometer journey to Seoul on foot. A unit of ROK soldiers coming down from the Choshin Reservoir had marched with them for a while. One ROK spoke in a low voice to Haraboji. He explained how on their retreat, the mighty Americans had bombed even their own troops because of faulty communication. Not once, but several times. One morning, they spied another plane overhead. It too sported American markings. The refugees scattered, some ran, some jumped in a ditch. Others, weary, just sat down and waited to die. A silky white powder fell from the planes like snow. It landed on some people and on others, depending on the wind. There were no explosions. A few minutes later, however, some people fell to the ground, seizing, including American soldiers. They died, foam pouring out of their mouths. They walked on. Later along the road, a British tank rider peered over and stared hard at Youngman. Then he tossed a round white object toward him. Youngman grabbed Youngshik and huddled over him. The white ball sat on the road and never exploded. The soldier had seen his disintegrating straw shoes, the frozen blood on his ankles, and tossed him a clean roll of bandages. Youngman used the bandages to warmly wrap Youngshik's head. He hoped to signal how sick he was. So if you've ever been in Korea in the winter, can I see a show of hands? Who's been in Korea in the winter? And then when the Siberian winds come down, it's extremely, extremely cold. I lived there for a year when I was a Fulbright fellow, actually researching my first novel. And it really actually did feel colder than growing up in northern Minnesota. I think there's something about the wind. And my friend Raymond Han, who is a fellow Fulbrighter who basically never left and is still in Korea, he reported to me today that in Seoul, it is 17 below.
Whoa.
And when it's below 50, I usually put a hat on. But I have noticed in pictures when I was doing research that almost nobody had like special winter clothes. Richer people would have sort of like maybe like slightly quilted hanbok, like the traditional Korean sort of robes. But obviously nobody had vincelite or puffer jackets. And from the pictures and the oral history, people said, no, you just kind of wear the same clothes like all the time. They're clothes. So, and I guess that's my father at the hospital. Here is just a picture of women in the Han River in 1948 when Youngman would have been 8, and they're just wearing clothes, and it's cold enough that they're out on the river. And in 1948, in particular, the weather was particularly cold that year, and because people in Korea tend to wear white, these women were almost out like every day doing this, not even wearing gloves. Nobody's wearing a hat.
Is that ice?
Yes, they're in the river. They're like topping a hole in the river, rashing the, just washing. So one of the things I couldn't wrap my hands around, as you see in this scene, is so when people had to evacuate, it was basically they would either hear people screaming or knocking on their door, knocking on their gates, going, the Chinese are coming. The Chinese have entered the war. You have to run for your lives. So they would literally like run for their lives with, back then people either wore something called gomoshin, which was these canoe like rubber shoes. It's just a piece of rubber basically, or I think they're called chipchik. They're straw shoes. They're basically like flip-flops made out of straw. And a couple people said, oh, I had to walk barefoot all during like to Daejeon, and I couldn't wrap my head around it. And I was almost afraid to write that because I felt like, how could you actually, on January 4th, like walk 50 kilometers just in your bare feet? So then enters Ancestry.com to the rescue. So KJ is my husband, Carl Jacoby, who he's also here, but as a present, he bought me an Ancestry test. Oh, by the way, surprise, I'm 100% Asian. But so we didn't expect this person to contact us.
Huh.
So I was uber suspicious, and I was quizzing him, like, who's your family? Where are they from? But sure enough, his family is from Pyongyang, which is where my father's from. And they also migrated south, and a couple of our clans matched. So I was like, oh, okay. So we started emailing together. And so I was like, can you ask your parents and grandparents, did they really, on January 4th, did they really walk in just their bare feet and their straw shoes? And this is what my long lost cousin said. Koreans then were just really, really tough and had tough little feet with calluses. That's what he got from his grandparents and parents. And so as an author, that just gave me so much more confidence to be able to write more forcefully into that without wondering, like, how do you literally do that without frost? Because so many of the Marines got frostbite and their toes fell off. But obviously, the Koreans are like, I guess maybe if you have calluses, you don't get frostbite. So the January 4th problem too was horrible, and nobody really even talked about it was because MacArthur made this huge mistake. So Lieutenant General Matthew Ridgway, who replaced him as commander of the 8th Army, famously said to the press, "The flight of the Korean refugees is perhaps the greatest tragedy to which Asia has been subjected in the course of its long history. So this quote is something any researcher who's intrepid can find in the archives. But when it's contextualized, it's deeply ironic. I found it interesting that people in my parents' generation still worship MacArthur, and he's actually considered a saint in certain shamanic practices. There's saints and there's Migadoo, like that. He's one of the saints that they call up. So the Incheon landing did turn the tide of the war, but that was the first time after Seoul fell. But then MacArthur got so greedy and had so much hubris that instead of just putting things back to where they were after they retook Seoul, he just was like, we're going to take the whole peninsula. We're just going to go right up to China, take everything. Oh, by the way, I want to run for president. So he did that. And he's like, oh, this is kind of weird. We were getting very little resistance, blah, blah. And we're going to be, it was the famous Home by Christmas at Thanksgiving where they flew these turkeys to people. And he's like, we're going to be home by Christmas. That's not exactly what happened. He brought the troops right into a trap, and the Chinese just entered the war. And it just became this huge bloodbath. The Chosin Rivers of war. Everybody's having to flee. The British are having to flee. The Marines are having to flee. The 8th Army is having to flee because MacArthur totally messed up. Which is again something that in history we're like, oh, MacArthur, he just looks like a general. He looks like Colonel Ridgely Ryan. But we kind of forget that this whole thing, this tragedy was just because of his mess up. So I'm going to read a little bit about how are we doing on time.
We have time. Another 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Then I get this perfect. Because let's see, I have a quick scene of a veteran. Yes. And this is Youngman's first, he's remembering his first patient when he first got to Horse's Breath, this small town where he lives. It's his first patient. And Youngman's feeling very awkward because the guy's wife has gone to the bathroom, so he's stuck there with the husband. Elmer had been so laconic, Youngman worried he might have some kind of selective mutism. Into this conversational void, he didn't say anything. He only unlaced his steel-toed work boot. Right in the office. Then he peeled off his red-top thermal sock. Youngman disliked feet. Koreans were clean, polite people who almost never showed their feet to one another. As he tried to think of a diplomatic way to point out the illogic of having the town's OBGYN look at a man's foot, the foot was there in his face. A prominent big toe, stubby, bulbous, smaller toes. The last two were missing. Diabetic necrosis, frostbite while sitting too long in a duck blind, snowmobiling. It smelled like an old closet. Fought at the Chosin Reservoir, he said. Middle of winter. They called our battalion the Chosin Frozen. I see, said Youngman. Our rubber-bottom shoe packs were so cheap, our feet would sweat while we marched and freeze when we stopped. They were slipperier than hell on those slopes. Guys would take them off and the feet would swell and they'd walk around on bleeding stumps later in the day. Youngman was frantically, telepathically summoning his wife back from the lavatory. In his year in America, it had seemed to him Americans expected Koreans to be abjectly grateful for America's part in their war. Elmer must have been a lad of 18 or 19 when he was shipped from his home in this tiny mining town to fight a war he probably didn't care about or understand. Sorry. Thanks. So this part is autobiographical to myself because when I was growing up in this small town, we were the only family of color in this all-white town, and people would often say, "Oh, you should be grateful you're here," or "Welcome to America." If I ever complained about racism, they'd be, and I was born in this town, "Go back to where you came from," was immediately the first thing. Or actually, I wouldn't even have to complain about stuff. Often people would just tell me to go back to where I came from. And I just be like, I'm from here. But on a personal level too, I was born there. My father was the town anesthesiologist for 40 years. I felt like I was just like the rest of the people there, yet having to always be the foreigner and you should be grateful just kind of got to me. And later too, when I understood history more, at the time I just felt like there's something awkward about this, but then, you know, getting older and learning actually it was the US that partitioned Korea into North and South. So with everybody being North Korea so evil or whatever, it's kind of like, well, you made it. It's like, you made it, you broke it. So it's just kind of strange how everything just kind of seeps into our culture in a way that makes no sense, but it somehow makes sense to American Empire and jingoism, and let's do another forever war, because wars are inherently good somehow. So, and I also wanted to mention one of the things that I also felt about American Empire and how it's just like so accepted is my best friend got married at the VFW, as one does in a small town. And I had to spend her entire wedding looking at a mural of a random yellow painted Asian soldier getting shot by a white soldier. And so these are all these kind of personal emotions that I would transfer to how I think young man would feel as a young man, having to deal, like, he's also an undocumented immigrant, so he knows he can't be yelling at people and he's really trying to work hard, but at the same time, how does he contain his rage at something like that? Okay, this is just a quick slide. So this is me and my mom, whom I somehow managed to sneak onto our trip to North Korea, which would be a completely, yeah, it was very unadvisable. It's a completely crazy story, which was for another time. But this is one of the things that, one of the reasons, so my novel like contains 5 books. It's chopped up into 5 books. And I want to explore how forced migration and war and history, and then how you end up as this weird family in a rural Minnesota town. And so Young Man's story is really like just one story, but as you can see, it's gesturing to my family story. And it's also onward to the 2 million children who were orphaned and separated from their families during the Korean War as my parents and Young Man, and the 10 million families that were ruptured by the Korean War. And kind of to close, and perhaps most importantly, I want to mention that what separates a nonfiction book from, like, let's say a nonfiction book about the Korean War and a novel, and this isn't a judgment, but it's like, there's an alchemical magic that occurs when fiction is able to combine a lot of disparate elements: history, characterization, plot, tension, so that the words on the page eventually start to breathe on their own. So, you know, after giving you this whole talk, I don't want you to take too much of a straight line from my research and then how the novel became formed, because this is going to be perfect. Okay, who is this guy and why is he smiling like that? So this is my friend Andy Greer coming to the rescue. This is his Instagram post from today about his research trip. So Andy's last novel was called Less, and it won the Pulitzer Prize. Whoa. Yes. So this is a picture from his first research trip after he wrote Less. It's technically, as he said, the first research trip for Less is Lost, which is the kind of sequel that just came out. But he says, this is me 6 years ago on my first research trip to write Less is Lost. I didn't know what I was going to write. Certainly not another Less novel, just that I needed to see parts of the US I did not know or understand. This is a Cruise America vehicle with space for my friend Doug to join me. I picked him up in Albuquerque. We visited the reservation where his uncle's plane went down. More foolishly, we went flooding, blah, blah. He says, none of this is in the book, just a joyful time. So basically, going back to me and my mom, I knew North Korea was going to figure the novel somehow. I knew I had to get there. It took me years to be able to sort of bash my way in. But North Korea has always felt very disconnected from my life, despite I have like a one generation like connection to the place. So being in North Korea was even weirder because you have no control over anything. You have no control what you're going to see, going to do or eat. But similarly, and this is just a metaphor then about how my process and how I work, is I just remained open and curious and had faith. I get to see what I needed to see. And I did. And I just really hope that this novel does justice to so many of our ancestors who passed away in the war. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. So we have about half an hour, more or less, to have a conversation and to hear from you, your reactions to the many, many things that Marie has shared with us. I'm going to take advantage of my privileged position here to start. And not to make this about me, but I just want to say that you mentioned, Marie, that this is fiction that gestures at your own autobiography. It also gestures, I think, at a lot of other people's autobiographies. And I just want to say, as somebody who's half of my family, my mother's family is all Korean, I found myself getting so caught up in so much of what was in the novel and what you've spoken about. I mean, let me just start with what to me was one of the most uncanny things. My mother's younger brother, Taeyang Chung, is an MD from Korea, who with his MD wife, just like Young Mun and his wife Young Ye, ended up, after the circuitous route that involved having to do their residencies all over again, even though they were fully fledged doctors in Seoul, they had to do their residencies all over again in places like, Tennessee and Ohio and Chicago, and then eventually ended up, I wasn't able to find out, I actually spoke to them last night, I wasn't able to find out exactly how, but they ended up in a little town in Missouri, where they and their children were, practically the only, Asians in the town. And I grew up mixed race in a rural town in Vermont, where, again, you feel different.
Is Vermont the whitest state in the nation? Okay, you were different.
Less white than Maine, I'm not sure, but yeah, so again, I don't want this to become about myself and about my family, but I feel almost as though your book is calling out in that way to these stories, these family stories. And I guess one question I want to ask you, I have so many questions and I want to hear other people's questions, but one question I have for you is it just my imagination, or is there something particularly silent about the Korean diaspora in this country? Maybe it's because I grew up in a very white, small town, but I feel, and I think it was probably different in Flushing, but it seems like these stories, they didn't get much airtime. And I'm reminded of there's a quote in here that I just want to read quickly. You write, "This was the value of being an immigrant in America. The future was what mattered. The past was immaterial. You could be what you wanted to be, a self-made man. Who cared what language Albert Einstein or say Horatio Alger originally spoke, what country he came from? What mattered was his immigrant success story, his American story." And I think that's incredibly true, but I feel like it's especially true of Korean Americans. And
Definitely.
Yeah.
I think one thing that's funny, there's two things. One of them is that the Korean War was dubbed the Forgotten War after I did some research in 1952, when the war was still going on. We decided, we're gonna forget it, it's still going on. It's obviously like some kind of weird propaganda thing. Of course, now that I think that, I'm forgetting the second
And the
thing.
Korean War is still going on.
Yes,
right?
exactly. It never ended.
Yeah.
And my first published op-ed in the year, it was in the New York Times, like almost 30 years ago, was called we Koreans need an Al Sharpton. Because it was all about all of the anti-Asian, anti-Korean violence going on in New York where I lived. And everyone was just like, because a lot of it has to do with immigration, a lot of it's cultural, you don't want to put your head up. But a lot of it was just sort of like, because I had to, even to get the lyrics, there was like a rap song that actually was like kind of about murdering Koreans and stuff. That's why I was like, we need Koreans to have an Al Sharpton to go around like, publicizing this. I had to go to the Simon Wiesenthal Center for them to give me the lyrics. Do you see what I'm saying? There was no like infrastructure for any kind of Asian American or Korean thing. And then all the Korean people that I wanted to talk to or interview, they're like, not on the record now, like, why are you stirring up trouble or you know what I mean? Like, we shouldn't cause conflict.
Right.
Where I just feel like it's obviously because I'm a different generation and I grew up, I agree. I feel like in the silences, I always felt like, when I got bullied in school, my parents were like, just ignore it. It'll be fine. Like you're better than them or whatever. But that's not it. What happens in the silence, that's where the violence and the vacuum of the silence is where all the violence happens. And I kind of feel like for the piece about for the emancipator, I call it the violence of forgetting. Because by calling Korea the forgotten war, we are forgetting all the trauma of those 56,000 Americans who died in their family and how it radiates outward. And if we don't unremember and remember, if we don't like unforget it and remember it, this is the forgetting and the silence is actual violence. It's violence against our country. And so I agree. That's a great point that you brought up, but it's obviously more difficult to parse out with silence than, what's noisy.
Yes.
And so that's a great point.
Yeah. Wow. Well, and something that you're saying and that comes through in the book and that I heard in your talk is that there's something about, and I don't want to exceptionalize, the Korean experience or the Korean diasporic experience too much. But there's something about the ongoing nature of war that seems like it's really central to what Koreans have gone through and what maybe Korean American experience is about as well. And again, I'm going to go back to the magnet of my family stories, but my mother's family, my mother was born in Manchuria, right across the Yalu River from North Korea in a city called Dandong, or it was called Andong. And so in 1945, she and her family had to flee to the Pyongyang region, which is where we had lots of family. So that's one big, like, left everything behind, traumatic refugee experience. Then in 1947, they had to leave again as, bourgeois landowners and so forth. They had to go to South Korea. So that was actually the worst effort, and that was incredibly difficult. So they ended up in Seoul. And then in 1950, there's yet another. So there's three war refugee experiences. And that, to me, in a way, symbolizes this sort of ongoing nature of war for the Korean Peninsula, for the Korean experience, the modern Korean experience, and also for the US experience, as you point out many times in the book. War just never seems to stop.
Oh, definitely. They are showing epigenetically that trauma is passed down to the next generation, if they didn't experience it. So that is really, just kind of from, I don't know, like a mental health point of view that needs to be addressed.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just kind of replicates itself into the next generation.
Well, I'd love to hear from others. Do we have any comments or questions from the audience?
There's someone in the blue sweater.
Sorry. Yeah, I was curious about within the novel. So I was only able to read part of book 3. And something I was curious about was your process of writing, like, interracial interactions between like Youngman and Korean characters with non-white characters. Because obviously there's a lot of interactions with like white allied forces, but also like in book 3 especially, there's one part where they talk about the orphan known as the professor, like almost being adopted because he was a light skinned, and another part like where the word darky is thrown around and things like that. And there's like, even when they're worrying about like rape crisis with like allied soldiers, the focus is on like, oh, but the Black soldiers are insatiable. And like, I was curious, like, what your process was like for writing that like obviously authentically, but also not. Because you talked about earlier, like not falling into the tropes and
Yes.
pitfalls that we've already heard over and over.
Yes.
Like, yeah, how you found, how
Right.
you struck that balance.
So historically, the Korean War was actually the first war that was desegregated, but then it was like a de facto, it was still de facto segregated because the white troops wouldn't fight with like the black troops. But then when they lost too many people, suddenly it was like, unsegregate quick. And so there was that, like historically. And then the second prong of that, so Youngman doesn't have a lot of experience meeting Black people because of that, because the war was mostly segregated. And he's on an Air Force base. And then the second prong of that is there is a very deep well of anti-Blackness in Korean culture. And a lot of that comes from the war, similarly to how the idea of, oh, Asian women are all hypersexual prostitutes comes from the men doing this and the US demanding this, and then them coming back to the US. And then later, years later, this 20-year-old guy shooting all those Korean women at their massage parlors. And then the white people saying, oh, yeah, that's too bad. He had a really bad day. I'm sorry, he was so stressed about it. So do you see what I'm saying? So it's kind of, the prong was me figuring out historically what the chances were that Youngman would have met someone who was Black, and it would have been very small given his situation. And then the other thing was just, talking to a lot of these survivors, and there is an N-word that Koreans use, and it's like coal. It's like something that people use, and people use it freely. But that Youngman himself kind of points that out when he's at church, when they're like, why are you going to North Korea when you could use the N-word, help them here? And Youngman's like, why are you guys like so churchy? So I kind of try to navigate it that way, kind of pointing out the hypocrisy of these Koreans who are so elite and Christian with their anti-Blackness. So, but then, Youngman also grew up in Korea, and he has some anti-Blackness himself. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, in order to make him a complex character, he's also like, because Einstein ends up having like this maid, and he can't even remember if she's Somalian or Ethiopian. And Youngman's like observations just are all over the place about immigration and someone from Africa. And I'm trying to make it as true as possible. So the racism also is something that I needed to write about and express on the page, including Youngman's own racism. And part of that I've got to admit that I have seen from, I can see my own parents and their colleagues like anti-Blackness. And when you go to Korea, there's still a vestige of these kind of like Sambo stereotypes in a lot of like anime or just, like toothpaste. So do you see what I'm saying? So it's kind of like, this is why war, when we forget it, is so damaging, because so much of this that started there has like filtered out into this more gentle, like diluted racism and murder and like anti-Asian violence and hypersexualization of Asian women. Yeah, so I really love that question. Yes.
I had a question. So I'm a history student, and I think my research focuses in a similar time period when so I investigated the U.S. Massacres of Korean civilians during the war and before the war. And so I think what I'm noticing is in my research that because there isn't a lot of historiography about my subject, that a lot of times fiction is used as a tool in history to kind of uncover these stories. And I think there's value in that, especially in the things I'm investigating, but also I find kind of what you mentioned earlier about people kind of demanding, like, you just write stories about your grandma or things like that, that there is an obsession with entertainment from the emotional trauma from that era, and that kind of takes the forefront sometimes. So
Yes.
I'm curious about what you kind of perceive your place as a writer in terms of uncovering the history of those subjects, because I think on one end, it is very valuable that these kind of stories and narratives are being brought up and talked about, and since they never have in kind of history discussions, but at the same time, like at what point do you see it kind of being damaging where people kind of use it as like those entertainment, like emotional
I think as an author, I felt like the more I allowed myself to get further into the story would finally like reveal itself to me. And it kind of felt like the author needs to put like this kind of diligence, because there is a scene of a massacre which did occur, which was something I heard in an oral history, and I think it's actually fairly famous, where I think it's during the one for the January 4th evacuation, where it's mostly old people and women, and they've got all their belongings, and they're being told by the US soldiers to cross the river. And there's a bunch of soldiers waiting on the other side, and they're like, no, we don't want it. They're going to shoot us. And they're like, no, you got to go, or we're going to shoot you. So they start wading into the river, and then of course they're getting shot. And so one character who is carrying, as they do, he's carrying his younger brother on his back, and his younger brother gets shot. So everyone thinks he's dead, and he floats down, and then he later like somehow escapes, or almost everyone gets massacred. And then he ends up becoming the leader of the houseboys, and the other houseboys are all, why don't you hate the Yankees? They murdered your family. But he's kind of like, no, I was so grateful because this guy in an army jeep came and picked me up and brought me here. And then he ended up being able to survive. Of course, he ends up being one of Syngman Rhee's goons later. But you know what I'm saying? Like in the whole fullness of life, these massacres happen. But at the same time, for that one character, it was almost because of that massacre, like he survived and was able to go on. So do you see what I'm saying? Like, I agree that I think one of the things, just as an egotistical writer, that I didn't like, was that when the novel was sold as the Einstein Code, it was like startups, speculative fiction, very male kind of Jonathan Franzen type, but it's Korean centered, and the son has these father issues and stuff, and he can never live up to his father, and the son's kind of horny, and just it's all this like whatever. And I felt very comfortable feeling like as that's kind of a prestige genre to be in. But then after 2016, I was like, I started writing more about Youngman, and Youngman had been more like the filler in between all the Einstein chapters. I was like, and I started writing more about Youngman. I kind of felt more and more, especially when people from my hometown were actually calling for genocide of North Koreans because Trump was all into that. And I was feeling like, wait, this is my dad? So I just felt more urgency. Like I wanted to write Youngman's story, but at the same time I felt, oh no, like the last thing I want to do is write an Amy Tan type story. I'm not dissing Amy Tan, but this is for me as a writer. That's not how I see like the work that I do. Do you know what I'm saying? Like I feel like the work I do is much more intellectual. I majored in econ, I was a banker. I'm really into late stage hyper capitalism. So do you see what I'm saying? Like, I just felt like, I don't want to write an immigrant story. Like, what am I doing? This is not what I want to do. But as I said, like by being diligent and sitting with the story for like a million years, the story began to reveal itself. And I want to also mention, publishing is like just the beginning of your problems. One of the things that happened with the publishing, and I guess I don't have to worry about people going back and telling my editor this because I know she'd be mad. But one of the reasons this book took so long is because I was like, wait, why can't you write it chronologically? Like Pachinko's chronological, it's this big epic. Why is it so fractured? And I'm like, because Youngman is an immigrant. And there's this, it's not even like fractured in like a consistent way, it's fractured. And I'm like, it's because of this. And I also said, I want to use an Asian narrative. I don't want to use rising action, denouement, climax. I want to do an Asian narrative that uses, so it's 5 books. The middle book is like a middle, and the proximity of the books drives the action. The cuts drive the action, which is very much of an Asian narrative. You don't need action. You don't need guns and blah, blah. It's the proximity. This is just like a kind of very traditional Asian form. But then they kept going like, no, it's too hard to read. It's not readable. Most people who are going to buy your book are going to be like middle-aged ladies. And what about the book clubs? And so we had this huge fight back and forth for years about this. And I stuck to my guns. It ended up just burning a lot of bridges. But one thing I felt so gratified now is that somebody interviewed Min-Jin Lee the other day, and she said she based her book structure on the Bible. And I was like, well, that makes 100% sense because she has a much more Western way that she writes. in mine, this is the way I'm writing this book. And the idea that, oh, you're Korean, you write about like, there's a little Korean war in hers and you're Korean and your books have, like her book was really successful. So we have to jam your book into this, was just so maddening. If you would have ever seen the cover, it looked exactly like Pachinko. It was a lady looking out a window and she was wearing hanbok from the Joseon dynasty. And I'm just like, no. You saw those ladies on it. They're in a small village. There's like 20 families. And I just felt so insulted. They were just like, here's your cover. Don't you like it? And I was just like, this is not right. So yes. So it's publishing is also a business. And one thing I will say that I did change is Youngman has a secret, and they made me, because I rejected so many of their editorial things, my agent said, you better give them like one little thing. So I made his secret more secret-y, where before it was more literary and it was just more diffuse, but it had to be more like, oh, it's a secret. You know what I'm saying? Like at the beginning, oh, he is a secret. And I was kind of like, oh God, what a gimmick. But then I was able to do that in a way that satisfied me. So that, again, this is why the book was under contract since 2012 and it just came out last May. But at the same time, I just thought, I'm going to live or die by this. And I did feel that, I did feel like the ancestors are watching this, and this book has to be what I need the book to be, or why would I even write it? Like, why do I want to write something, I'd rather just give the money back, which was what I considered a couple times. So I'm just pleased because I like it. So I don't care if other people like it. So I'm happy.
Oh, wow. Do you want to pick a hand? All right.
Hi, so I'm really interested in your comments about writing amidst the silence. I have an adjacent experience that I want to write about. My family's from Guam, and my grandfather experienced the war camps and died recently, and we didn't really get to hear much of his story. And I just was hoping to hear a little bit more about writing through the silence and like with instinct and combining that with research, and how you found that helpful.
Well, what's funny is, for instance, I even got my mom enrolled in this thing called Korean American Story, where it was kind of like StoryCorps, and they'd have a microphone. I figured she'll tell us something now, but she still like told us those very weird fractured stories that didn't make sense. And so finally, after that kind of resistance, and now she has dementia. So similarly, like to your situation, that avenue is gone. And so as much as I regret it and don't, I feel like I did the best that I could. And so the next part of it, though, in some ways, because my parents were so close-lipped about it, it made me more motivated to talk to people now. And you also may find out people who are not related to you may be more interested in telling you. And then again, you also have to remember too, that memory is a weird thing, and that everybody's has their own filters, and that they don't know, it's not like they don't always tell you the truth, but they just tell you how they remember it. So it's not also as if just by taking a bunch of oral histories, I could make this either. But I will say that I have just recently realized this about myself, that emotionally, I think the whole book was trying to write myself back to my parents, because I wanted to know what their life was like, even though Youngman is a different generation. I think because they never told us, and just imagine growing up in rural Minnesota with people calling you chink all the time. They wouldn't even call us Korean because no one knew what Korea was. Do you know what I'm saying? And then me going to my parents, why are we here? Why are these kids doing this? And my parents just going just tell me you're American. They never even said, tell me you're Korean American. Just growing up in this weird bifurcation. And then later, because we grew up this way, I have 3 siblings. My 3 siblings, do not eat Korean food. They hate kimchi. I'm the only person in my family who can speak Korean. And now my mom has dementia. It's kind of crazy because I'm the only person who can talk to her. Yeah. But you see what I'm saying? It's actually possible to grow up this way. You know what I'm saying? That's their choice. But it's just kind of weird how all this stuff has been completely erased. And so, yeah, I think it's great that what you're kind of I don't know, your jam is, and that, do you know what I'm saying? Because it's so amorphous. Yeah, it's so amorphous what it is, but you know what you're looking for something in there. And so you're just going to have to find other weird ways. But similarly, like I didn't expect a guy to be like, hey, I'm your cousin. Do you know what I'm saying? Like a lot of times if you just put it out there, like some weird things like, well, they will come to you. Yeah, for sure.
Yes.
So my question is, human hides the fact that he had a small brother back in Korea. He doesn't tell anybody till the end.
That's the secret, right?
Yeah. So while writing the novel, have you ever thought about like changing a story in which he tells that he has a brother? And did you think that would it change the trajectory of the story?
I think every single thing that you do changes your trajectory in your whole life. So no.
Yes.
I actually did not read your book. Someone had mentioned your book to me and kind of told me it would be not similar, obviously now that I've heard you explain it, but I don't know if you know the movie Ode to My Father.
Oh yeah,
Um,
definitely. Because that was the Hamhung evacuation. Yes.
Yes, so I'm half Korean. I grew up in Korea. Dad was in the military. I'm currently in the military, so I know a lot of background on the Korean War, but from a very military standpoint. Ode to My Father was one of the first real personal storytelling I've actually experienced. It's funny that you say your mom doesn't mention much because my mom's side of the family doesn't really talk about.
Oh,
anything
interesting.
Prior to the 80s. But with that being said, so growing up in Korea, I've had the, Yankee go home
Mhm.
type deal, and from a mixed variety of ages, not just like younger people
Mhm,
who are around my age. The US always causes incidents somewhere. It's just
Yeah,
it's
it's a
just
thing.
it's not just US, it's just humans, but even older people who tend to appreciate the fact that they are not, under communist regime, also have said Yankees go home, especially when I was there growing up, there was an incident where a tank ran over 2 high school girls.
Yes.
So incidents like that. From your book, did you ever consider looking at maybe the diaspora of Koreans that have relations with soldiers and their lifestyle after that and then immigrating, which is exactly what my mom did, but just a narrative, I feel like listening to your story, similar to my mom's, different immigrations, because she's the first with her sister, both married to US PIs, that moved to the state. Still haven't seen a book on that yet, so.
I actually did. So basically, I just did bales and bales of research, most of which didn't get used, kind of like my friend Andy going on his road trip. But I did do a lot of research in women who married American GIs. And similarly, actually, to your question too, it's still quasi-segregated. Like the prostitutes who service Black soldiers are not allowed to service white soldiers, and it's still the de facto thing.
Even now.
Yeah, as far as I understand.
Huh.
And I was involved with a woman's sort of rights, a Korean women's rights thing called the Rainbow House in Flushing for a while. And there was a very famous case of someone named Yoon-gu-mi, who was a Korean woman who got completely raped and mutilated and murdered by an American soldier. And because of the SOFA treaty, they just let him go home and let him leave. So I kind of got interested in how does this work and what is the Gichichon, like the kind of like like the sort of shanty towns that surround, like I wanted to know more about like what are like how does this dynamic work? And so no, I did do a lot of research, and one thing that was like really interesting is one of the most surreal things that I did was I went to this thing called the Bride School that the USO runs. And so it was run by these like sort of elderly like white ladies who are teaching these Korean women, mostly who did not speak any English. So I was a little bit like, they're getting married to these dudes that don't speak English, don't speak any Korean. And they were, because I spoke a little Korean, they kept going like, "Honey, sister, what is this? What is this?" And I'd be like, it's Campbell's mushroom soup. They're like, "Why is it standing up like that? That's not soup." And they would just be saying these really funny things. It just gave me this interesting, but they were all like really like motivated. Do you see what I'm saying? Like Koreans are so good at studying. So these women were like studying how to become great wives. So there was hygiene, there was cooking, and there was like law. And so it just gave me like a really interesting view into these women like who on the outside, like they're clearly like the way they were dressed and everything, they're clearly like prostitutes, but at the same time, they were like these women who were just like all set to do that. And then, you know, as you probably know, like historically, most like the Korean diaspora is kind of situated around the women who married people in the military coming here and then bringing over their relatives. So it's actually that dynamic that has made the Korean diaspora, but because Koreans tend to, you know, not feel that that's like a positive light, like that again is something that historically we don't think about. Do you know what I'm saying? Like no one thinks like, oh, there's all these Koreans in the US, but no one's like, oh, but a lot of it is a product of, you know, Korean women marrying people in the military. So it's just like all this kind of weird stew that's almost impossible to untangle. But I'm constantly still trying to untangle it because I just always want to know why things got the way that they are. And yeah, and it's interesting. And I'm sorry that you have that experience because it's kind of interesting too. Like there's so many different gradations because when I was like in Korea, like trying to learn Korean the first time, my best friend, my roommate was like African-American. And it was just so funny how like these things quickly become inverted where because I couldn't speak Korean well, like everyone was just yelling at me all the time about what a dummy I was. And then my friend would say, "안녕하세요," like once. And so do you see what I'm saying? Like there's always these different like hierarchies about why people are mean to other people. Do you know what I'm saying? Where I'm like, wait, she doesn't even speak Korean and you're all like, oh, 잘했어. And I am, so do you see what I'm saying? Like there's always like these weird like things that go on, or just like because my parents are North Korean, obviously there's like Mongolian blood in our line, like I have sankapo, like double eyelids. So everyone's like, oh my God, you're so beautiful. Like one time and the rest of the time, like you're so stupid, you don't speak Korean. And it just becomes this like weird thing, especially after growing up with so much anti-Asian violence when I was growing up thinking, oh, I'll be in Korea, it'll be great. And it being very mixed experience.
Wow, okay. Is there maybe one last question? Yes, okay.
yeah.
And then let me just say that after that, I believe we have some goodies.
Oh,
here
yes,
for
yay.
you. We have some refreshments and we also have some books which you're very welcome to purchase and to have Marie sign for you if you wish.
Sorry, we've been making a lot of noise here, but we're setting up
Awesome.
wine, cheese and books here, but, and I wasn't gonna ask questions because I practically neighbors, good friends, but I just couldn't help myself. I love this book. So for those of you who haven't read it, please buy it, read it. It's amazing. And for me as a historian of a war, in my case, Vietnam War, I could never make that jump to writing a book like this. I feel like I don't have that sort of historical researcher depth. And in the way that, you know, and I feel like I've done a lot of research too. Sorry about making it all about me. And, you know, knowing Marie, there's so many questions I have about even particular details about what she was able to do with this research that she had done, whether it be, you know, historical research during the war era or traveling to North Korea and bringing what can, or bringing alive what Minnesota looked like in the 1980s. It's amazing. So there was a question that I had specific ones about how you dealt with, like, you know, the sort of the DMZ and the trading, but I'm not going to go there. The question I had, and maybe this will wrap things up, is, you know, you started with the sort of the silence that, you know, as someone who's not Korean but works on East Asia, Korea and Korean culture, different place now than it was even a few years ago.
Oh, definitely.
So how does that figure with the reception of the book? And then, you know, sort of going forward, if you can't say that, you know, sort of Korean culture is invisible, I think it actually dominates in many ways. What does that mean for future writers? How would this book, or has it been received? How is it being received in South Korea? And in any way, if you can find out in North Korea, and is that something that you want to sort of take to the next level with the introduction of even, you know,
Well, the odd thing is that we have not sold the Korean rights, and that's been a little bit of a mystery. So no, we don't really know I haven't gotten a lot of feedback, random, sometimes people say like their parents really liked it. But you know, to your point about Korean culture suddenly becoming dominant, I also find it interesting because it kind of skips over everything, because suddenly, oh yay, it's Squid Game, K-pop. Do you see what I'm saying? And we skip over the Korean War and everything that happened, because one thing that I would love to learn more about from you at some point is, you know, I was just getting little inklings of it, but it's kind of like one of the reasons they stopped the Korean War so quickly. And also Syngman Rhee and Kim Il-sung did not show up at the armistice. Again, it was just like proxies, we're done, because Syngman Rhee's like, I still want to fight. So did Kim Il-sung. But it's like, the US is like, we have more important things to do. Like we have to like start partitioning Vietnam. Do you know what I mean? Like the mechanisms from the partition, if I'm correct, started around 1953. So it seemed like we were like, oh, you know, we made all this mess here. We're going to do the exact same mess over here. We're going to have a communist state. And do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I'm kind of amazed that this happened and that we're just kind of going on this like treadmill of forever wars where I'm just kind of like, that wasn't enough for you, that this failure. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So it's so interesting.
With one possible, we talk about those of you who think of my US East Asian relations, MacArthur is an idiot and he doesn't deserve the accolades that he gets. And you can see that now from his career, you know, even before Korea, World War II, he just kind of hit out.
Right, but the Philippines,
Yeah.
it's 16-year-old mistress.
Well,
Come on.
We teach that in at least my class, but.
Excellent.
Can I just say one last thing, which is that I forgot, I wanted to ask you about your future work. Because you are writing even now, right?
Yes.
What's
I actually have
next?
another novel coming out, and as I like veer off of like really weird subjects, I have another young adult novel coming out, and it is a Korean American retelling of Mice and Men. But instead of the bunkhouse, it's the Korean cram school. Yeah, where all the weird racial and socioeconomic dynamics happen. And again, it's going to be a weird book, but I like it. So we'll just see what happens. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you so
you so
much,
much.
Maria. Thank you.
Thank you.
And why? Geez, books.
Excellent. Oh, I'm glad to Excellent.
So, thank you. I'm sorry I started blathering so much about myself.
That was really good. Thank you. And also thanks for saving me with a PowerPoint.
Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks for coming. What's your name?
Lexis.
Hi, Lexa.
Hi, I'm a first